People like you don't belong here." The words hung in the air so sharply that even the soft music drifting through the luxury showroom seemed to fade for a moment. What nobody knew was that the quiet single dad standing beside his daughter had already built something far more valuable than anything displayed under those bright lights. On a cool Saturday morning in Scottsdale, Arizona, Ethan Walker pushed open the glass doors of Pierce Luxury Motors with his 10-year-old daughter at his side. The showroom gleamed beneath rows of crystal-clear lights. Polished marble floors reflected the silhouettes of million-dollar vehicles. The scent of fresh leather and expensive craftsmanship filled the air. Sophie Walker slowed as they entered, her blue eyes widening with wonder. She had spent weeks reading magazines about exotic cars from the local library, carefully cutting out photos and taping them to her bedroom wall. To her, this place felt like stepping inside a dream. Ethan smiled as he watched her. Seeing that look on her face was the only reason he had driven nearly 40 miles that morning. They weren't there to buy anything. They were there to look. Sometimes that was enough. Sophie stopped in front of a silver hypercar displayed on a rotating platform. "Daddy, look at that one." Ethan nodded. "Beautiful engineering." "Do you think it's the fastest one here?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "But speed isn't what makes a car special." Before Sophie could ask what did, a voice interrupted them. "Can I help you?" Ethan turned. A man in a tailored navy suit stood several feet away. His name tag read Brandon Pierce. The showroom manager's smile appeared professional at first glance, but his eyes carried none of the warmth. They moved quickly over Ethan's faded work boots, worn denim jacket, and weathered pickup keys hanging from his hand. "We're just looking," Ethan replied politely. Brandon gave a short nod. "This showroom is reserved for serious clients." Sophie glanced up at her father. Ethan remained calm. "We won't be in anyone's way." Brandon's smile tightened. "Sir, these vehicles start well above $600,000. Ethan said nothing. Brandon stepped closer. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable at one of the dealerships down the road." Several nearby sales associates exchanged looks. One quietly smirked. Sophie's shoulders sank. Ethan noticed immediately. The little excitement she carried into the building seemed to dim. He gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart." Brandon motioned toward the entrance. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The room grew quiet. A few customers turned their heads. Sophie lowered her eyes to the floor. Ethan's expression never changed. No anger. No argument. No embarrassment. Just the quiet dignity of a man who had long ago learned that character mattered more than pride. He nodded once. "Come on, Sophie." Together, they turned toward the exit. As the glass doors opened, sunlight spilled across the parking lot. And at that exact moment, a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop near the entrance. The CEO had just arrived, but she wasn't looking at the showroom. She was staring at an old car parked alone near the far corner of the lot. And the moment she saw it, she froze. Victoria Hayes stepped out of the black SUV and barely noticed the executive assistant speaking beside her. Her attention remained fixed on the aging dark green coupe parked near the far edge of the lot. The paint had faded beneath years of Arizona sun. The chrome trim carried tiny imperfections. To almost anyone else, it looked like a well-kept classic owned by a man who simply loved old cars. But Victoria was not almost anyone. Her breath caught for a moment. "That cannot be possible," she whispered. The assistant blinked. "Ma'am." Victoria did not answer. Instead, she walked toward the vehicle with measured steps, her eyes narrowing as she studied every line, every contour, every detail. 20 feet away, she stopped. 10 feet later, she slowed again. By the time she reached the driver's side door, the confidence she carried into boardrooms worth billions had been replaced by something far rarer. Uncertainty, respect, disbelief. She carefully touched the edge of the front fender. Hidden beneath the chrome was a tiny design feature almost nobody knew existed. A subtle curve no manufacturer had ever copied correctly. A signature, not written with ink, written with engineering. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. She had seen photographs years ago. She had studied old blueprints. She had listened to industry legends talk about a man who disappeared at the height of his career. A man many believed would have changed the future of automotive design if he had stayed. "Who owns this car?" she asked quietly. The assistant looked around. "I do not know." Victoria straightened. "Find out." Back near the entrance, Ethan and Sophie were already walking toward the parking lot. Sophie tried to be brave, but children rarely hid disappointment well. "I am sorry, Daddy," she said softly. Ethan looked down at her. "For what? Maybe we should not have come." Ethan smiled. "The only thing that matters is that we spent the morning together." Sophie nodded, though the sadness remained in her eyes. As they approached the old coupe, Victoria finally saw them. At first, she focused on Ethan. Then her gaze shifted to Sophie. Then back to Ethan again. Something about the way he moved seemed strangely familiar. Calm, unhurried, completely unaffected by what had just happened. Most people would have left angry. Others would have argued. Ethan had done neither. Inside the showroom, Brandon Pierce watched through the glass walls. One of the sales associates stepped beside him. "Why is the CEO standing next to that old car?" Brandon shrugged. Probably some collector thing. But even as he said it, uncertainty crept into his voice. Outside, Victoria slowly circled the vehicle. Her eyes landed on a small metal plaque near the windshield. Most people would never have noticed it. The inscription was tiny, almost hidden. Yet the moment she read the name engraved there, her expression changed completely. Years of speculation, years of rumors, years of unanswered questions suddenly collided into a single possibility. Victoria looked directly at Ethan. "Excuse me, sir," she called. Ethan turned politely. "Yes." For several seconds, she simply stared. Not at his clothes, not at his worn boots, not at the faded jacket. She looked at him the way a historian might look at a long-lost artifact that was never supposed to exist anymore. Then she asked the question that made the entire morning take a sudden turn. "Did you build this car yourself?" For a moment, the parking lot seemed to hold its breath. Ethan looked at Victoria Hayes, then at the old coupe beside them. His expression remained calm. "Yes," he said simply. Sophie glanced between the two adults, confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. Victoria stared at him as though she had just confirmed something impossible. "You designed it?" she asked. Ethan nodded once. "A long time ago." Several feet away, the executive assistant lowered his tablet. Even he could sense that this conversation was no longer ordinary. Victoria ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the roofline. "The Phoenix prototype," she said quietly. "I thought it was lost." Ethan gave a faint smile. Most people did. Inside the showroom, Brandon Pierce was now standing near the entrance with two sales associates. Through the glass, they watched the CEO speaking to the man they had dismissed only minutes earlier. None of them could understand why. "What is happening?" one associate whispered. Brandon folded his arms. "I have no idea." Outside, Victoria looked back at Ethan. "Do you realize how many people have searched for this car?" "Not really," Ethan replied. "I stopped paying attention years ago." Victoria almost laughed. It was not amusement. It was disbelief. Entire automotive forums had debated the vehicle for over a decade. Collectors had offered rewards for information. Industry leaders had spoken about it like a modern legend. Yet the man standing before her acted as if none of it mattered. Sophie gently tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy." Ethan looked down. "Yes, sweetheart." "Who is she?" Victoria smiled before Ethan could answer. "My name is Victoria." Sophie nodded politely. "I am Sophie." Victoria crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "You have a very special father." Sophie smiled. "I know." The answer landed with more force than any speech could have. Victoria stood again. For a second, her gaze lingered on Ethan. The industry knew stories about brilliant engineers. They knew stories about innovators who changed entire markets. But they rarely talked about what happened after success. They rarely talked about sacrifice. They rarely talked about loss. Ethan seemed completely uninterested in recognition, and somehow that made him even more remarkable. "Would you come inside for a few minutes?" Victoria asked. Ethan glanced toward the showroom entrance. Through the glass, he could see Brandon watching. Sophie saw him too. The memory of being asked to leave was still fresh. "We do not have to," Ethan said gently. Victoria followed his gaze. Her expression sharpened immediately. For the first time, she seemed to understand exactly what had happened before she arrived. "Mr. Walker," she said carefully, "I would consider it a personal favor." Ethan hesitated. Not because he wanted an apology. Not because he wanted revenge. He simply disliked attention. Victoria seemed to recognize that. "There is something I need to show you," she added. Sophie looked up hopefully. "Can we see more cars?" Ethan smiled. "Looks like we can." Together, they started walking toward the entrance. Inside, Brandon quickly straightened his jacket. Several employees stepped aside. The atmosphere felt completely different now. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was smirking. The polished showroom suddenly felt smaller than it had 10 minutes earlier. As Victoria pushed open the glass doors, every conversation stopped. Shoes clicked against marble floors. Air conditioning hummed softly overhead. Dozens of eyes followed the quiet single father as he entered once again. And for reasons none of them yet understood, the CEO walked beside him like he was the most important guest in the building. The moment the doors closed behind them, the atmosphere inside Pierce Luxury Motors changed completely. Employees who had barely acknowledged Ethan minutes earlier now watched his every step. The polished showroom floor reflected the overhead lights like still water, and the quiet hum of the climate control system seemed unusually loud in the silence. Victoria guided Ethan and Sophie toward a private display area near the center of the building. Several concept vehicles sat beneath soft spotlights, each one representing years of research and millions of dollars in development. Sophie stared in amazement. "Wow," she whispered. "These are incredible." Victoria smiled. "I thought you might like them." Ethan noticed something else. Every employee they passed suddenly became very busy. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others glanced his way and quickly looked down. Respect had arrived faster than honesty. Victoria stopped beside a silver concept car and turned toward Ethan. "Do you know how many times your name came up during engineering conferences?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "I stopped attending those a long time ago. People still talk about you." Ethan smiled faintly. "People talk about a lot of things." Before Victoria could answer, Sophie quietly tugged on her father's sleeve. Ethan immediately looked down. "What is it, sweetheart?" Her voice was soft enough that only he could hear it. "Daddy, why did that man want us to leave?" Ethan's expression remained calm, but for a brief second something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not resentment, just the familiar sadness every parent feels when a child encounters unfairness for the first time. Sophie continued, "Did we do something wrong?" Ethan knelt beside her. The noise of the showroom faded away. Victoria stepped back without speaking. Even the nearby employees seemed frozen in place. "No," Ethan said gently. "You did nothing wrong." Sophie looked unconvinced. "Then why?" Ethan took a slow breath. "Sometimes people think they understand someone before they actually know them." "Because of our clothes?" she asked. Ethan smiled softly. "Sometimes." Sophie looked at the floor. "That does not seem fair." "No," Ethan agreed. "It is not." For a moment she remained silent. Then she asked the question that struck far deeper than she realized. "Does it happen to you a lot?" Ethan looked at his daughter. The innocence in her eyes made the answer difficult. "Enough," he said quietly. Sophie frowned. "Does it make you sad?" Ethan thought about that. He thought about the years after his wife passed away. He thought about the jobs he had taken, the opportunities he had quietly walked away from, the assumptions strangers often made. Then he looked at the little girl who had become the center of his entire world. "Not really," he said, "because what people think about me is not nearly as important as what I know about myself." Sophie considered that carefully. "And what do you know?" Ethan smiled. "That being kind matters. That keeping your word matters. And that character is something nobody can take away from you." Sophie finally smiled back. Across the room, Victoria watched in silence. She had spent years surrounded by powerful people, wealthy people, influential people. Yet standing there, listening to a father explain dignity to his daughter without bitterness, she felt something she had not expected to feel that morning. Respect. Deep, genuine respect. And at that exact moment, she made a decision that would change the rest of the day. Victoria stood quietly for several moments after Sophie and Ethan finished speaking. Around them, the showroom slowly returned to motion, but something had shifted. The polished building still looked the same. The expensive vehicles still sat beneath the lights. Yet the room felt different now. It felt smaller. The confidence many people carried only minutes earlier seemed far less impressive beside the quiet strength of a father who had chosen humility over recognition. Victoria finally turned toward her assistant. "Please clear conference room 1. The assistant blinked. "The executive presentation is scheduled there in 20 minutes. "Not anymore," Victoria replied. "Move it." Within seconds, phones appeared. Messages were sent. Schedules changed. Employees hurried away. Ethan noticed immediately. "You really do not need to do all this." Victoria smiled. "Actually, I do." Ethan looked unconvinced. Why? Victoria glanced toward the old coupe visible through the showroom windows. Sunlight reflected across its weathered paint. Because for 12 years I've been trying to understand why one of the most gifted automotive engineers in America vanished. Ethan laughed softly. I think gifted might be a little generous. Victoria shook her head. No, it is not. Sophie looked up at her father. You designed cars? Ethan smiled. A few. Victoria almost laughed again. A few. She looked at Sophie. Your father helped create technologies that are still being studied in engineering programs. Sophie stared at Ethan. Really? Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Some people worked very hard on those projects. Daddy. Sophie folded her arms. That was not an answer. For the first time all morning, several employees nearby smiled. Ethan sighed dramatically. Fine. Yes. I worked on some interesting cars. Sophie grinned. That is so cool. Victoria watched the exchange with growing curiosity. The story she had heard over the years painted Ethan Walker as an industry genius. Yet standing here, he seemed far more proud of being a father than anything else. That realization explained something many people had never understood. It explained why he disappeared. Not because he failed. Not because he lost his talent. Because something else had become more important. As they began walking toward the private conference area, Victoria noticed a framed photograph hanging along the hallway. It showed a corporate gala from nearly 15 years earlier. Dozens of executives stood smiling beneath bright lights. Ethan's eyes briefly paused on the image. Victoria noticed immediately. You were there, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. Long time ago. That was the year everything changed. Ethan remained silent. The hallway suddenly felt quieter. Sophie looked between them. What happened? Ethan studied the photograph for a moment. The younger version of himself looked confident, ambitious, certain of the future. Then his expression softened. Life happened, he said gently. Sophie accepted the answer, but Victoria understood there was far more behind those two words. Success, loss, sacrifice, choices. Entire chapters hidden beneath a simple sentence. As they reached the conference room doors, Victoria paused. She looked at Ethan with sincere respect. I think there are some people inside this building who need to understand exactly who you are. Ethan smiled politely. That has never been very important to me. Victoria slowly opened the door. Maybe not, she said. But today, it is about to become very important to them. The conference room fell silent as Ethan stepped inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the showroom below, where customers and employees moved between displays of polished steel and glass. A long walnut table stretched across the center of the room. Around it sat senior executives, department directors, and engineering leaders who had been preparing for a quarterly strategy meeting only minutes earlier. Every conversation stopped when Victoria entered. The silence deepened when they saw Ethan and Sophie walking beside her. Confused glances spread around the room. Victoria remained standing at the head of the table. Thank you all for adjusting your schedules, she said calmly. There is someone I would like you to meet. Ethan immediately looked uncomfortable. Sophie noticed and squeezed his hand. Victoria continued. Many of you have spent years studying one particular engineering project. Some of you have referenced it in presentations. Some of you have built entire development strategies around concepts introduced by its creator. Several executives exchanged curious looks. One engineering director leaned forward. You are talking about the Phoenix platform? Victoria nodded. Yes. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even among professionals, the name carried weight. The project had become part legend, part mystery. A breakthrough design that appeared years ahead of its time before its creator vanished from the industry. Victoria turned toward Ethan. The man responsible for that work is standing in this room. Several people blinked. One executive frowned. Another sat straighter in his chair. A third quietly whispered, "No way." Victoria looked around the table. Everyone, this is Ethan Walker. The reaction was immediate. Not dramatic. Not loud. Something far more powerful. Silence. Genuine silence. The kind that arrives when assumptions suddenly collapse. The engineering director stared openly. Ethan Walker? Ethan offered a small, polite nod. Hello. A woman from product development looked stunned. We studied your suspension architecture during graduate school. Another executive shook his head slowly. I thought you retired overseas. I heard you joined a racing team. I heard you started your own company. Ethan smiled faintly. Most of those stories were not true. Sophie looked up at her father with wide eyes. Every person in the room suddenly seemed interested in what he had to say. The same father who drove her to school. The same father who packed her lunches. The same father who fixed things around the house. Victoria watched her expression and smiled. Then she turned toward the large display screen mounted on the wall. A photograph appeared. It showed a younger Ethan standing beside the original prototype over a decade earlier. Several executives visibly reacted. There was no longer any doubt. Victoria folded her hands. The innovations developed by Ethan Walker influenced technologies that still generate revenue throughout this industry. Ethan shifted slightly. A lot of talented people contributed. Victoria nodded respectfully. And that answer explains exactly why none of us have heard from you in 12 years. A few people laughed softly. Not at him. In appreciation of the humility. Through the glass walls of the conference room, another figure stood watching from the hallway. Brandon Pierce. His confidence was gone now. As realization settled across his face, he understood something that could not be undone. The quiet customer he had dismissed that morning was not simply another visitor. He was the man many of the most respected professionals in the industry considered a living legend. Brandon Pierce remained frozen outside the conference room as executives continued speaking with Ethan. Every compliment felt heavier than the one before. Every story about industry breakthroughs seemed to erase another layer of certainty he had carried that morning. Through the glass wall, he watched Sophie sitting proudly beside her father. The little girl who had lowered her eyes in embarrassment less than an hour earlier was now smiling. Inside the room, the conversation continued. An engineering vice president shook his head in disbelief. Your thermal management system was 15 years ahead of the market. Another executive nodded. We still reference parts of your design philosophy. Ethan listened politely. Technology moves forward because people build on each other's work. The answer only increased their respect. Victoria leaned against the conference table and studied him carefully. She had spent years negotiating with powerful personalities. Most successful people wanted recognition. Many demanded it. Ethan seemed determined to redirect every compliment toward someone else. That humility was becoming impossible to ignore. A soft knock interrupted the room. Everyone turned. Brandon stood at the doorway. His posture was noticeably different now. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. Victoria looked at him calmly. Yes. Brandon swallowed. May I come in? The room remained silent. Victoria nodded once. Brandon stepped inside. For a moment, he seemed unsure where to stand. The same showroom manager who had controlled the floor only an hour earlier now looked like a man trying to find solid ground beneath his feet. His eyes moved toward Ethan. Mr. Walker, he began. Then he stopped. He cleared his throat and tried again. Ethan. The room watched quietly. Brandon took a slow breath. I owe you an apology. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. This morning I judged you before I knew anything about you. His voice carried none of the arrogance from earlier. I saw your clothes. I saw an old car. I made assumptions. Ethan remained calm. Brandon continued. And I was wrong. The words seemed difficult for him to say, which made them sound honest. Sophie looked at her father. Ethan simply listened. Brandon glanced down briefly before meeting Ethan's eyes again. I embarrassed your daughter. His voice softened. That bothers me the most. The room grew even quieter. Sophie blinked in surprise. Brandon turned toward her. I am sorry, Sophie. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Sophie looked at Ethan. Ethan gave a small nod. She turned back toward Brandon. Thank you, she said. The simplicity of her answer seemed to affect him more than any criticism could have. Victoria watched carefully. What happened next would reveal more about Ethan than any engineering achievement ever could. Ethan stood. Slowly, Brandon straightened instinctively. We all make mistakes, Ethan said. The important part is what we learn from them. Brandon looked genuinely surprised. There was no anger, no lecture, no attempt to humiliate him in return. Just grace. Quiet grace. Several executives exchanged glances. They had expected confrontation. Instead, they were witnessing character. Victoria smiled softly. In that moment, she understood why Ethan Walker's greatest achievement had never been the cars he designed. It was the man he had chosen to become after walking away from everything that once made him famous. The room remained quiet after Brandon left. Not uncomfortable quiet. Reflective quiet. the kind that settles over people when they have witnessed something they did not expect. Victoria walked toward the large window overlooking the showroom floor below. Afternoon sunlight spilled across rows of vehicles, turning chrome and glass into ribbons of gold. Then she turned back toward Ethan. "There is one more reason I asked you to stay." Ethan smiled lightly. "I suspected there might be." A few executives chuckled. Victoria folded her hands. 3 years ago, Hayes Automotive began development on a project that was supposed to redefine the future of performance engineering. She pressed a button on a remote. A series of images appeared on the large screen. Sleek concept sketches rotated one after another. Technical diagrams followed. Then simulation data. Then projected production plans. "We have invested hundreds of millions of dollars," she continued. "And despite having some of the best engineers in the industry, we keep running into the same problem." Ethan studied the screen. His expression remained neutral. "Efficiency lost during thermal cycling," he said. Several executives stared at him. Victoria smiled. "You figured that out in less than 10 seconds. Ethan shrugged. The graph gave it away. A few engineers exchanged amazed looks. One quietly shook his head. Victoria stepped closer. "That is exactly why I want to make you an offer." Ethan already seemed to know where the conversation was heading. Sophie looked between them with growing curiosity. Victoria took a slow breath. "I want you to join Hayes Automotive as a senior engineering advisor." Several executives nodded immediately. One looked relieved that the proposal was finally being said out loud. Victoria continued. "Full flexibility. Your own schedule. Equity participation. Resources. Staff. Anything you need." The room waited. Sophie looked at her father hopefully. Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds. Then at the engineers. Then at Victoria. Finally, he looked down at his daughter. "That sounds generous." Victoria smiled. "It is serious." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then I should be equally serious in my answer." The room became still again. "I cannot." Several executives visibly deflated. One engineer leaned back in disappointment. Victoria remained composed. "May I ask why?" Ethan smiled and rested a hand gently on Sophie's shoulder. "Because every morning I make breakfast for my daughter." Sophie smiled. "And it is really good breakfast." A few people laughed. Ethan continued. "I take her to school. I help with homework. We eat dinner together. We watch old movies on Fridays." He glanced at Sophie. "Usually her choice." "Not always," she corrected. "Sometimes your choice." Ethan nodded. "Fair point." More laughter spread through the room. Then his expression softened. "For a long time, I chased achievements. Some were worthwhile. Some were not. But after losing my wife, I learned something important." Nobody interrupted. "Success is wonderful. Recognition is nice. But time is the one thing you never get back." The room fell silent again. Victoria listened carefully. Ethan looked at Sophie. "Right now, this is where I want to be." For the first time that day, nobody seemed disappointed. Because everyone in the room suddenly understood exactly what he meant. And Victoria realized the most valuable thing Ethan Walker possessed was not his talent. It was knowing what mattered more than it. For a few seconds after Ethan finished speaking, nobody said a word. The executives around the table looked at one another. Then back at the man who had just turned down an opportunity many people would have spent a lifetime chasing. Outside the conference room windows, the afternoon sun continued drifting across the Arizona sky. The showroom below remained busy, yet the world inside that room felt strangely still. Victoria finally smiled. "You know," she said, "that is probably the first time anyone has rejected one of my offers because they wanted to make breakfast." Soft laughter filled the room. Ethan smiled. "Then I am glad to provide a new experience." Even Victoria laughed at that. Sophie grinned proudly beside her father. She no longer looked uncertain or embarrassed. The little girl who had entered the building feeling unwelcome now sat surrounded by people who respected the man she admired most. Victoria walked toward the window overlooking the parking lot. Her eyes found the old coupe sitting quietly beneath the sunlight. "May I ask something?" she said. "Of course," Ethan replied. "Why did you come here today?" Several executives looked curious. It was the one question nobody had asked. Ethan followed her gaze toward the parking lot. Then he looked at Sophie. "Because she likes cars." The room went silent again. Victoria blinked. "That is it." Ethan nodded. "That is it." Sophie laughed. "I told him this place had amazing cars." "And she was right," Ethan said. One executive shook his head in disbelief. You did not come to buy anything? Ethan smiled. No, another executive stared. You came all the way here just so your daughter could look at cars. Seemed like a pretty good reason. Nobody knew what to say after that, because suddenly the entire day looked different. The misunderstanding, the assumptions, the apology, the recognition. All of it had started because a father wanted to spend a Saturday morning doing something his daughter loved. Victoria slowly nodded. Then she turned toward everyone in the room. I think there is a lesson in that. No one disagreed. A few minutes later, Ethan and Sophie made their way back through the showroom. Employees greeted them warmly now. Customers glanced over with curiosity. Brandon personally held the front door open as they approached. Take care, Sophie, he said sincerely. You too, she replied with a smile. Outside, the late afternoon air felt cooler. Ethan unlocked the old coupe and opened the passenger door for his daughter. Before climbing inside, Sophie paused. Daddy, yes. Today was weird. Ethan laughed. A little. She looked at him carefully. Are you famous? Ethan pretended to think about it. No good. Why? Sophie smiled. Because I like having you all to myself. Ethan felt his throat tighten slightly. That works out perfectly, he said. Because I like being your dad more than anything else. As the engine quietly came to life, Victoria watched from the showroom entrance. Around her stood executives, engineers, sales staff, and managers. None of them spoke. They simply watched the old coupe pull away and disappear into the fading Arizona sunlight. In the end, the rarest thing anyone saw that day was not the legendary car parked in the corner of the lot. It was the character of the man who drove it. And as the vehicle vanished beyond the horizon, a quiet silence settled over the showroom. Not the silence of embarrassment, not the silence of shock, the silence of understanding.